We're now in part 12 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, our discussion. Part 12 of our discussion of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Here we're going to discuss the unique work of a human being. We're going to discuss three candidates for the work of a human being. First candidate is life of nutrition and growth, the work that is responsible for nutrition and growth. Second candidate is life of perceiving, the work that is responsible for perceiving. Third candidate is life of articulate speech, the work that is responsible for articulate speech. And here we're going to discuss what knowledge is, roughly, for Aristotle and for our purposes. All of this is a part of our rather independent investigation into what the highest good is as happiness, after we have left behind the survey approach, in which we're just surveying the opinions of different people about what happiness is, as well as looking at the criticisms of those conceptions of happiness by means of filtering those opinions about happiness through the criteria of the theoretical attributes of happiness that are completeness and self-sufficiency. Part 12. Progressing further in our philosophical investigation into the highest good, Aristotle recognizes that the goodness of anything or any being is in the work that it does. Remember, anything that exists performs some sort of a work as it is on its way toward its good or goal by nature, right? So progressing further in our philosophical investigation into the highest good, Aristotle recognizes that the goodness of anything or any being is in the work that it does. For example, a good pencil is one that does the work of a pencil well. A good pencil is the one that writes on paper in an erasable way well. And a good pen is one that does the work of a pen well. A pen writes on paper in a much more permanent way than does a pencil. And a pen that does that well is a good pen. And a good tree is the one that does the work of a tree well. Likewise, a good human being is one that does the work of a human being well. Again, we're talking about the work of just being a human being, right? In no way are we talking about work for paycheck. In no way are we talking about work for some sort of a product. The only product we're concerned with here is that of being human as such. So we just need to realize what the uniquely human work is, or being at work, and doing that well or with excellence is what happiness is, right? A good pencil is one that writes well in an erasable manner, and so that's a happy pencil, so to speak. And a good human being is one that does the work of a human being well. And a good human being is one that is happy, right, in terms of our discussion. So we just need to figure out what the unique work of a human being is, just like the work of a pen is different from the work of a pencil and that of a tree. What makes a good pen is not the same thing as what makes a good pencil, and what makes a good tree is also not the same thing as what makes a good pen. The clue for locating the human being at work is that it must be unique, not shared with other kinds of being. Three candidates for an answer emerge here. The first candidate is to say that simply living is the proper work of a human being. Is simply living the proper work of a human being? It is not. For that is something that we share even with plants. But the work of a human being must be unique to the human being. Even though living is part of the work of a human being, it is not its essence. It's not what distinguishes us from other kinds of beings. On another note, we may say here that contrary to what we may frequently hear in quick comments, survival is not the proper work of a human being, right? We frequently hear something like that. Survival is happiness. Survival is what being human is all about. Here comes Aristotle, and he goes, no. Even plants do that sort of a thing. Whereas human happiness is according to the uniquely human nature of a human being, right? So simply living is not the candidate we accept for the proper being at work of a human being. What about perceiving as the second candidate? Is perceiving the proper work of a human being? Aristotle's answer is that it is not. But that is something we share with other animals. Wolves, pigs, all of them engage in perception, unlike plants, but like human beings. If we think about what we share with animals, as opposed to what we share with plants, it is clear that what Aristotle means here is the kind of perception that allows to engage in locomotion from place to place or action. In order for us to act, to change our location in space, we have to perceive what it is that we are pursuing by our movement from one place to another or by action. Right? I'm thinking if we were thinking about the difference between plants and animals, we'd probably say that animals engage in action. Well, Aristotle's point is that they engage in action by perception. And more or less, an animal that perceives well does pretty well. But perception cannot be the work of a human being, since it is something that we share with animals. And anyway, our action primarily takes place not through perception, like with animals, but more about that in a moment. For example, in order for me to get out of bed and open the door to step outside of my room, I have to perceive the door as what is outside that door once I open it. All right, so action requires perception, and it seems like in the case of animals, action just requires perception. Furthermore, the perception here is not only that of the straightforward five senses, seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, but also importantly, perception is of pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain are part of the perception that motivates action. We pursue where we perceive pleasure, and we avoid where we perceive pain. Or we move toward that which attracts us and move away from that which repulses us. True, but that is not unique to human beings. Even animals do that sort of a thing. And so that cannot be the uniquely human work. And that cannot be the excellence of that sort of a thing, can't be what makes a good human being. But again, this kind of perception that motivates action through attraction and repulsion is certainly a part of the human being at work, but it's not the essence of it, since that is something we share with other animals. Reasoning, the third candidate for the uniquely human being at work, however, is a uniquely human work that no other animal does. Aristotle argues that reasoning is the uniquely human being at work. Or as he puts it, life that puts into action that in us which has articulate speech, or being at work of the soul in accordance with reason. So this kind of rational activity of a human being is the uniquely human aspect of who we are. And if what makes a being good is what is unique to it, then our goodness seems to reside in our rationality, as does our happiness, right? Since happiness is the good. Aristotle's point here is that a uniquely human way of living is through reason, rational thinking, or knowledge. That is to say, that the properly human way to live and make choices is through exercise of reason, knowledge, and judgment, rather than perceptions of what is attractive and repulsive alone. Our lives go well, and as they should, when we employ knowledge and understanding, as opposed to act merely instinctually, according to simply what appears to our perception to be pleasant and painful. For example, we are much better prepared for the weather tomorrow and next week when we consult what the meteorologists tell us through the knowledge and science of weather, rather than when we gauge the weather simply by how we feel and how we perceive it to be. Everything around us, other than the merely natural environment, is built through knowledge by us. And the best way of navigating the social world is also through knowledge, rather than without it. Our days go much better when we plan them ahead through knowledge, rather than doing whatever we feel like in the moment at each moment. What does knowledge mean here? Such that it uniquely belongs to human beings and to no other animal. Knowledge here means conceptual understanding that explains reality in terms of laws and principles and links them into a coherent system of knowledge. Our common sense understanding does this to a smaller and more implicit extent than does our institution of the sciences. Other animals operate at the level of associations. They remember what comes together with what, but without understanding. They remember that fire produces heat, burns, and causes pain, but do not understand why, and do not link the understanding of that with understanding the rest of nature at the conceptual level. In other words, our animal friends don't do chemistry. Chemistry is a uniquely human science. And that's the sort of a thing we mean by knowledge. Well, that's a best example of it, perhaps. We explain phenomena, whereas other animals do not. And finally, knowledge is a social and not merely individual affair. We discuss with each other our thinking, pass it down from one generation onto the next, and thus our knowledge multiplies. Animal communication is in terms of passing instincts on from one generation down onto others, and that's a much slower process than is knowledge. Human knowledge, its communication, passing of it from generation to generation, all of that takes place in language, which we share with other members of our linguistic communities. Animals other than human, on the other hand, operate at a much more basic instinctual level of perception and associations.